Okay, so my name is Mike Fettis. This is going to be a talk about Splunk as a CLI, and it's more of the idea of interacting and working with Splunk from the command line, and then wrapping that up into something a little bit prettier. But I guess let me roll back. Who am I? I have a bunch of different websites. I have a blog up on GitHub.io. I write for Medium and subsequently Hacker Noon. And all of the code that I'm going to be talking about is released open source on GitHub underneath my username, writing and traffic. It's Splunk TAC CLI TAC DID. Everything here is transparent. Everything I'm doing is there. So first things first. I'm an old SRE. I've done infrastructure automation. I do security engineering, and I'm currently a cloud security engineer. So I'm not speaking on behalf of my employer, so we're just going to leave them out of it altogether. I've been using Splunk for over 6 years, and I've done a lot of stuff along the way in all realms of everything. All right, so Splunk in the real world. We have two options. You have the blue pill and the red pill. The blue pill is the single pane of glass with your Phantom automation, your GPS visuals, your dashboards, and your mobile apps. Everything pretty and shiny and front end. The red pill is terminals, scripts, and machine automation, computer automation. You get your JSON, you get your APIs, and lots of Docker. All of the ugly, horrible stuff. So you can take the blue pill and stay in this fuzzy, shiny world of front end and UIs, or take the red pill and we're going to follow me down into the world of DevOps and SRE and awesomeness. So Splunk is really good at working with complicated data and making unstructured data really easy. And when you don't know what you don't know, or when you need to sift through data visually but in some type of sane way. So when you're exploring and digging, Splunk's great. Splunk makes sense of all that. But with that ease comes a lot of limitations. These limitations are usually like the search box and how you get data into the search box, or how you get data into your searches, and then how do you get that data back out to do anything else with it. You know, Splunk wants you to stay inside the Splunk application, but sometimes you need things out of Splunk. So data, we're all here for the data, and like I said, it makes it easy to get data in, but it's less easy to get data out. It makes it really hard to actually get data out. So Splunk also makes it really hard to make Splunk modular from the idea of other applications working with Splunk without writing another application inside of Splunk to deploy and whatever. I just want Splunk to do one thing. But Splunk wants you to stay in their happy little ecosystem and in their happy little app. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's great. It works for a lot of things. But there's mountains of use and mountains of value if you can take data out of Splunk and use it elsewhere. And I want to take you out of the Splunk UI. So how am I going to do that? Well, we're going to make Splunk into a module. We're going to make Splunk pretty much immutable. And we're going to make it ephemeral so that everything that we're doing inside of these things is all managed as code, managed as one unit, and you can pass that around. And it's going to treat Splunk as just another tool in the toolbox instead of the entire toolbox, which I know it's a little bit blasphemy. It's probably why this talk got rejected. That's okay.
We love you anyway.
So when I'm scripting, I want the Splunk brain. I want to use all of Splunk's knowledge and all of Splunk's intelligence, but I want to take it out and I want to build it into what's called an operator model. And that operator model I'm going to go into in a second, but that model is then very easy to plug Splunk into actual SRE playbooks and run books. We're not talking about phantom things, we're talking about a checklist. So what's this operator model? I want a README text file that can sit in plain text that will tell people how to run and how to use it. Then I don't want to walk them through the UI with screenshots because UI changes and the screenshots might not look the same. And doing that type of documentation with screenshots, it's always confusing and you can never store it in a very simple, dumb format. So there's the idea of playbooks, runbooks, and when you're working in SRE and DevOps, you get a checklist that you can hand off to the overnight crew saying, if this happens, run these commands, do these things. And if you haven't automated that because you still need a human to look at it, they will know what to look for. And then if something is outside of their script, then they call you. But again, it's a simple checklist. It's a list of things. It's scripts. So let's work from that checklist and let's start plugging in Splunk into everything else. So we're going to dive into code now because I don't like to talk about slides. I want to dive into some stuff. So here's a quick screenshot. I will do a live demo and it'll be fun later. But so how am I doing this? So first off, I'm taking the Splunk SDK. The Splunk SDK for Python is out there. You download it. There was a very simple run search Python script. I took that search and I tweaked it ever so delicately so that it's no longer reading from the Splunk RC file for username and password. Those get read from environment variables. Same thing with the Splunk host so that I can plug in different usernames, different hosts, different clusters on the fly. That's the only changes I made. I turned that into just a raw Python script, and from there, I'm wrapping all that in Bash. Very simple so that I can just call a Bash script. Bash will invoke the Python, and because I'm doing it that way, I can load in that last line there, line 29, where I can put in plain text of a Splunk search, pass it into the search, it'll run it, and then I'll start getting JSON back out of Splunk. Nice and easy. Why would I want to do that? Well, there's a lot of CLI tools in the DevOps SRE, whatever the heck you want to call it, toolbook. You have the AWS CLI, you have all of your Jenkins stuff, you have all of the curl, all of the REST, all of the everything that everyone uses. It all follows a similar structure of put arguments in, get JSON out. You also have a phenomenal tool called JQ, which lets you manipulate these JSON blobs in amazing and awesome ways, and I want to use that for Splunk. So I just set a whole bunch of dependencies and whatnot, and sometimes having everyone's computer set up the same way is a real pain in the butt. So that's where Docker comes in. So some of you have heard of Docker. Docker is essentially a thing that gets built that builds a container. That container is for the lack of a better word, a virtual machine that you can then hand off to everyone else. It's not really a virtual machine, but just go with it. It's one build artifact. So what we're going to do is we're going to build our scripts, drop it into the Docker container along with all of our dependencies like the Splunk SDK and our JQ dependencies and OpenSSL dependencies, stuff that people might not have installed. We're going to drop all that in and be able to have every single person on our team pull down the latest Docker image, have access to all of our scripts, all of our dependencies, and it will behave exactly the same way for everyone. Then it goes a little bit further. So following this Bash wrapper idea, we're going to take the Docker run commands, abstract that out into a simple Bash script so that you call one CLI command, pass it your search, and then that script is behaving and treating Docker almost like a binary on your machine anyway. So you're not even really realizing you're running the Docker container, you're running a binary terminal, and it's doing everything in the background, spins up Docker, does its thing, spins down, it's done. So everything is much like a Postgres script, much like anything else. You know, we're turning Splunk into just another data source. That's all this is really about. It's just data in, data out, move on. But why would you do that? I'm running Splunk out of a Docker instance as well. So because everything Docker, all of the searches you're seeing are going to be run off of Splunk Docker on my laptop. I'm going to also build on top of the Splunk Docker image and add the ability to do Docker and Docker inside of that so that the Splunk Docker can invoke other Docker containers. And it gets really weird because some things are going to happen with the search box. And I'm going to be able to invoke a Docker container from the search box. Why would you want to do that? Because now instead of all of your custom Python scripts that you're loading into Splunk, you're telling Splunk to run a Docker container. You never need to refresh the code on the instances that are running that. You just publish a new Docker container artifact to the registry and Splunk will automatically pull that down for you on the next run. So you don't maintain code on the search heads anymore. You maintain the Docker container in a separate build process. That also means it is infinitely debuggable because you can run that Docker container on your box. You don't need to go anywhere else. You don't need to go into production. You run that container just as it would. It will behave just the same on yours. We have repeatability. So, and it's all going to run in the terminal, and it's going to kind of look something like that. And then it's going to look even weirder because Splunk is going to look like a terminal. We'll get there. So, here we go. Let's see if my plan works. So let's drop out of here. Let's dive in. I'm going to work off of a couple notes here just to make sure I hit all my talking points. So first things first, we have our GitHub repo that I've pulled down and worked with before. It's all Splunk CLI DID. As I said before, I slightly modified a make file. So Coldman has built out this amazing thing called the Splunk app boilerplate. It uses a make file in order to run nice commands on it. I forked it so that it would use my own image instead of the standard Splunk image, but we'll get there, and that is just abstracting out these make commands that you're going to see me run. So first things first, we're going to talk about the CLI before I even get into Docker. So we're going to go into my CLI folder. And yep, we're not seeing that up there, so we're going to do it this way. I'm sorry about that. Let me turn. Okay, so we have things. All right, so inside here we have the git SDK command. So what is the git SDK? So I wrote a little script in case you don't have the SDK. What it does is it essentially goes out and pulls down the latest version of the SDK, put it in the same tarball, and then I can extract it. So I don't necessarily need to do that because I already have the SDK. And I'm going to source some environment variables. Environment variables are just username, password, and my host. My scripts leverage that, so I'm going to need that a little bit later. So we're going to nuke that one. I set environment variables. Now I have a username, a password field, and my Splunk host sitting in memory. So what is this thing doing? So I have a thing called the search. The search is that Python file that we talked about a little bit earlier. I need to throw all of this up top. There we go. So this is that Python script. It's the example script with a few changes to it. And when I run my command here from notes, I'm going to do a get results help. So all of my bash scripts have a nice little help functionality to it. So everything that is a script has a help function. That help will essentially give me exactly what you see, helpers. So I have a local Splunk instance running, and I am going to do a get results and pass in some Splunk syntax here. We all know and love Splunk syntax. And it will churn for a second, and I added an extra S at the end. So let's get rid of that. There you go. Whole bunch of JSON blob. That's kind of awful. So we're just going to start piping things. So pipe it into JQ. And we have sane data, again, directly out of Splunk. So that's cool. What else can we do? All right. So we did that. We have a more elaborate search example. So my search example, we're just going to do it this way. This one doesn't accept anything. This is just outputting a bunch of stuff. So why do I have that? Because I want to make it really easy for other people to write bash scripts to create searches. So the search example is a simple thing. I even set these passwords ahead of time to make sure that I had them. All it is it's invoking that search location, which is that search Python script, passing in a REST call, outputting the table, and then I'm adding in the JQ and parsing out only the results. Cool. So let's see the next piece. We have job search. So how many times have you run into an issue where someone filled up their job quota and you needed to go through and delete all of the SIDs for the quota? Super annoying, super obnoxious. I just want all of the SIDs out and I want to pipe all those SIDs into something else. So let's go take a look at job search. Someone's going to break a world record. All right, so he's going to break a world record. That's cool. So job search. Job search takes a couple parameters. One's mandatory, one's optional. So we have the username and the job size. So right now I'm running everything as admin because I'm on my machine and I get to do that. So this is going to come back with all of the SIDs that I just fired off. They're pretty small. But all right, so I want only the searches that are bigger than 0.3 megabytes. That will then clean it up and only return that search. So what do I do with that? So if I want the SIDs only, I'm just going to pass in that and pass it over to JQ, output the SID, and great, it has quotes around it, so we're going to do a raw mode from JQ, and we get the SID. Now, I tried this last night and it didn't work because I didn't have the right permissions and I didn't feel like fixing it, but this is how it would work if I fixed the permissions. So we have a job delete option, and all I need to do is call one script, pass in the SIDs because job delete, here, let's roll back, let's do search and job delete. And if I do the help mode for that, all it takes is the SID. So I can pass this search or pass that command, all of the SIDs from the prior one, and it's going to say method not allowed because I didn't set up the permissions. But it runs the first search, grabs all of the SIDs, throws it into the second search, deletes all of those searches. So you can nuke all of the jobs that someone created instantly, quickly, without having to go through the UI, search, sort, click, 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 and then get RSI or something. Who knows? So that's one way of fixing, of using these scripts to fix things. So here we have another one about macros. So a lot of the times you want to see a macro, and before I knew that command a function E or whatever exposed macros, I was super disappointed when I found that out. But this would help me find macros. And it will very quickly and easily give me macros back out. So let's go take a look at macro land. So we have macros, and great, I can throw in a macro name. So I want the DMC macro, it's a default macro. Cool, so let's do that. Let's do this. And there's the macro for that command. So similar things for when I need to find indexes. So I see I'm running a little short on time. I'm going to speed this up. Okay, so I have another one for find indexes. A lot of the times, how many times have people asked about what's this index, and everything is named in a semi-sane way, but something is not. So for us, we're just going to say like what, I know it's named main, but something in the naming convention screwed me up, so I'm just going to search for index, and there's my index name that came back because I didn't create extra stuff. But you know the index has some part of it, you can kind of fuzzy match and find all those indexes back out very quickly, easily, rather than having to dig through the UI or look at some doc. So, all right, how does this relate to Docker? So I've created a couple different Docker files here. I have what's called the Docker in Docker Docker file, lots of Docker in that one. And all that is the Splunk Docker that's forked to allow certain packages to allow the Docker host to be bound to the Docker container, which words. Lets you kick off Docker containers from inside of Docker, and you get this weird Docker inception loop where everything is running, but it lets you do some really fun things. And then there's another one called Splunker. Splunker is just the Docker container I made off of the Python 2.7 whatever Docker Hub repository. So it's just the default Python with JQ installed. So how am I going to use those? Cool. All right, moving through. So I can go to my bin script, which is inside of Docker. And if I do that inside of here, I've created a bash script that is going to wrap around my Docker command so that I can invoke it just from a bash thing, because I don't want to remember all of the syntax for exec docker run tac rm, all of these flags, all of these image names, all of these versions. I don't want to do that. So I wrote a script called symops that's going to let me do that. And all that is going to do is essentially invoke those CLI scripts, but inside of a Docker container. So I don't need to worry about my Python development, the SDK living anywhere or any of the other dependencies. You build the Docker image, push it up, someone pulls it down, runs it, life goes on. So let's do that. So if we go out of the CLI and we go inside of my Docker, let's see, I think I had that in my notes because I didn't want to confuse myself. Cool. So you could do it from inside of this Splunk DID bin, or you can set it to your path variable, which then lets you invoke it directly. I'm going to set it to the path variable so that I'm not screwing around. There we go. There's my path. That session now has a path, and I can run the exact same thing from pretty much anywhere. So if I get out of here, I'm running there, it behaves just like a binary. So what that is doing is it's invoking my Docker container, running the bash script, which is then calling back out to the Splunk host that I have set in my environment variables and getting data back out. Right now that was just a help file, so let's actually do some real data, and we're going to do the same search from before. And pass in index star, table star, because there's not a lot of data in there. Behaves exactly as my regular CLI scripts, but it's living inside Docker. So I can go through and do all of those things, or we can start to see something slightly different. And since I only have a couple minutes left, I'm going to do that. So why would I care about putting stuff in Docker containers? Well, not everything is Python, not everything is Bash. Sometimes you have Ruby, sometimes you have Go binaries. All that stuff needs to live in there. So if I throw all of that stuff in my Docker container, then anything with the Docker container can call it. So what if I want Splunk to call it? Now this is Splunk Docker, and the search box has a nice little commands structure that I built as part of the app here. So inside here, I have a very simple commands.conf, which is in my default app, which lets me call my bash script. And from there, I'm going to do something slightly interesting. I have a SimOps thing, and that's what I'm going to call. So let's play a game. We're going to do script, SimTechOps, and what was some good commands? We have an nmap wrapper. So I have nmap installed on my Docker container, and I have a bash script that's going to wrap nmap, and I'm going to have Splunk run nmap without doing anything else to Splunk. This might take a couple seconds because nmap is incredibly slow, but now our statistics table displays nmap output. Kind of weird, kind of interesting. You can also make it a little bit more Splunk sane by wrapping a few other things around it. And was that the right one? Yeah, it is this one. We're going to let this play out.
They're really loud.
Beautiful. All right, so I threw in some other extra variables and whatnot, and it's going to display it in more of a Splunk fashion. You have your host, you have your IP, you have your fields, you have your statuses, you have your up. You can then run spath against this and essentially re-ingest that data from the command line. You don't need to do anything special. You can ingest data, pull data from any running pre-compiled code inside of that Docker container whenever you want. Or you can just use that Docker container as your operator interface. You get a 2-for-1 deal out of it. So if you want to go back in the Splunk UI, you can. So with great power comes great responsibility. You saw in my comp files here, I left it all wide open. There is not a whole lot of anything exposed. So before you run and grab my code and start running it, remember that if you don't lock things down, you can do terrible things, because this is creating a terminal into my Docker container. And I forgot to do something. So cat, okay, oh, SimOps. There we go. So all that script is really doing is redirecting things, and it has access to anything that the Docker container is running as. So make sure you know what you're doing before you just dive right in, because if you don't, here's my Etsy password for my Docker container. So, yay, surprise!
Special bonus.
Special bonus, I've just rooted my own box. That's all I have.